In the late spring of 1900, in the clear water off an uninhabited Greek island called Antikythera, a wreck had been sleeping in the darkness for 2,000 years. A sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis descended through that blue, weighted down in a canvas suit and copper helmet, and found himself standing on the deck of a ghost. He surfaced gasping, tearing at his helmet, and told the captain there were dead men everywhere on the bottom of the sea, covered in bronze. What he had actually seen were statues, marble gods and bronze athletes scattered across the seafloor where the ship had gone down. Antikythera was a wind-battered shelf of limestone that sailors had always feared for its hidden reefs. The Greek government sent the Royal Hellenic Navy, and over months of dangerous diving through the treacherous current, the divers brought up a haul that made headlines across Europe. Statues, glassware, jewelry, bronze figures, amphorae still sealed with their original contents. Every eye fixed on the treasures, on the marble athletes and the drowned gods, on the sheer luxurious weight of what a single merchant ship had carried. And among all of it, unremarked and unrecognized, lay a lump of fused and blackened bronze, roughly the size of a large hardcover book, encrusted with 2 millennia of sediment and coral. It was small enough to fit in a satchel, about the dimensions of a modern laptop power brick, and beside the marble giants, it looked like nothing at all. It was brought ashore with everything else, cataloged alongside the treasure, and carried to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where it would sit largely ignored for nearly 2 years. Nobody understood what it was, and nobody in that room had any framework for understanding what it was. Then, in 1902, an archaeologist named Spiridon Staius examined the object more closely, and through a crack in the crust he saw something that should not have been there. A gear wheel! Finely cut, precisely toothed, unmistakably the work of a skilled hand. The kind of mechanism no one expected from the ancient world. His colleagues were largely unmoved, suggesting it might be part of an astrolabe, or some simple clock carried aboard by one of the ship's passengers. An anomaly, nothing more. But the closer anyone looked, the stranger it became, because a precision gear of this quality had no business existing aboard a merchant vessel sailing the Mediterranean in the 1st century before Christ. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the geometry deliberate, and yet it sat there, posing 2 questions that no one could answer. Who had this machine been made for? And why, of all places, was it here, at the bottom of the Aegean? In 1902, nobody had the tools, the patience, or the conceptual language to understand what they were looking at, and that understanding would take another half a century to arrive. When that understanding finally began to arrive, it came not from a classical archaeologist, but from a British physicist and historian of science named Derek de Solla Price, working at Yale University. Price had spent years trying to understand how ancient people thought about mechanism, about the cosmos, about the machinery of the sky itself. And when he encountered the Antikythera fragments in 1951, he recognized, with what he later described as a shock of conviction, that he was looking at something with no known parallel anywhere in the ancient world. There was nothing like it, nothing before it, nothing after it. For his landmark study, Price commissioned X-ray photography from the Greek Atomic Energy Commission, hoping the radiation would see through the crust into the hidden architecture beneath. What those images revealed was a machine that had once contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, arranged with a precision that modern engineers had not thought possible for any craftsman working in the ancient Mediterranean world. His 1959 paper and his monograph of 1974 were the first systematic attempt to reverse engineer the device from its shattered surviving fragments. Price concluded that the machine could predict the positions of the sun and the moon, and that it tracked something the Greeks called the Metonic cycle. The ancient Greeks, and before them the Babylonians, had noticed that 19 solar years and 235 lunar months fall back into alignment with an error of less than 2 hours. A discrepancy so small, it would take roughly 300 years to accumulate a single day of drift. 19 years from now, the moon will be in almost exactly the same phase, on almost exactly the same calendar date, as it is tonight. That ratio, accurate to within less than 13/1 millionths, had to be expressed not as an equation, but as a physical ratio of meshing teeth, each gear's count chosen so that the whole train, turning together, arrived at the right answer through the logic of rolling bronze. To encode that in meshing gear ratios was not craftsmanship. It was arithmetic made physical. If a hand-cranked bronze box that predicts the heavens is the kind of story that keeps you watching, take a moment to subscribe, because the deeper we go, the stranger this gets. In 2005, an international consortium of scientists, historians, and imaging specialists turned techniques of a new order onto the fragments Price had studied by X-ray. Using polynomial texture mapping and three-dimensional X-ray tomography, they pulled text and gear structures out of the corrosion that no naked eye could ever have seen. They recovered more than 2,000 characters of inscription, the fragmentary remains of what amounted to an instruction manual, written in Koine Greek. And on the back of the machine, the imaging revealed two great spiral dials, whose complexity deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The upper spiral was the Metonic calendar, that same 19-year drumbeat we watched Price decode in his Yale study, now rendered as a single winding track of 235 lunar months pressed into the back of the machine. Below it wound the Saros eclipse predictor, 4 tight turns of 223 lunar months, its surface alive with tiny engraved glyphs marking the months that would carry an eclipse. And those glyphs reached further than any astronomer's table of the period, recording not just the month, but the hour of day, and in some cases, the expected color of the darkening and the direction of the wind that would accompany it. Someone, 2,000 years ago, had built a machine that told you not just when the sky would go dark, but what color that darkness would be. Then, in 2024, researchers at the University of Glasgow applied imaging techniques adapted from the study of black holes to the front zodiac ring. They concluded that the ring had most likely contained between 354 and 355 holes, an almost exact match for the lunar year. For decades, the consensus had held that the mechanism tracked an Egyptian solar calendar. That consensus was wrong. The device was tracking Greek time. It was keeping the rhythm of a specific world, a specific people, a specific sky. With every decade of scrutiny, the machine grew more sophisticated, and with every layer of sophistication, the vertigo deepened. Because now the researchers knew what it could do and were beginning to understand how. But the hardest question of all remained unanswered. Among the smaller dials on the back of the mechanism, there is one that at first glance seems almost trivial. A subsidiary indicator inscribed with the names of athletic festivals. When researchers finally read those inscriptions, they found the names of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic contests, Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, and Pythia, alongside what appears to be the Na Games held at Dodona. The temptation is to read it as a curiosity, a diversion for the wealthy sports enthusiast. But that instinct is wrong. Because the world these games belonged to had no shared calendar, no central authority, no unified way of measuring time. Each city kept its own month names, its own year reckoning, its own religious festivals that answered to no one else. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years, became the closest thing that fractured civilization had to a universal timestamp, a single beat that every Greek, in every city, could count to together. When a Greek historian wanted to fix an event in time so that a reader anywhere might understand it, he did not give a date, as we would. He wrote, "In the 3rd year of the 72nd Olympiad." So the games dial was never a sporting curiosity at all. It was a political instrument, a device for synchronizing yourself with a shared time across a civilization that had no other means of doing it. And then there is the other dial, the one that dealt not in festivals, but in the darkening of the sky itself. That lower back dial, the Saros spiral we first encountered in the imaging lab, now showed its full purpose. 4 concentric turns of 223 lunar months, each glyph a standing prediction pressed into bronze 2 millennia before anyone would read it. Each glyph carried more than a date. It named the hour, and sometimes the color the moon would wear as it darkened, and the quarter from which the wind would blow across whoever stood beneath it. Now, in the ancient world, an eclipse was not understood as a predictable event of celestial mechanics. It was an omen, a divine message, a signal of catastrophe or of favor descending from the gods. Imagine, then, the power of standing before a frightened crowd as the light drained from the world and saying, calmly, without fear, "I knew this was coming." There are recorded instances across classical antiquity of battles halted, sieges abandoned, and decisions reversed in the sudden terror of an unexpected eclipse. And the man who could foresee one held authority of the highest order. The Saros spiral placed exactly that foreknowledge into the hands of whoever turned the crank. Bronze back panel of mechanism covered in dense Koine Greek inscription. But who was that person meant to be? And did they even understand the machine they were holding? The text on the bronze back panel was not decoration. It described, in plain Koine Greek, the common tongue of the Hellenistic world, rather than the specialized language of philosophers, how to read the dials and what each pointer indicated. This was a device that came with an instruction manual. And that single fact tells you it was never built for the expert who understood every gear, but for someone who needed to be told what they were looking at. Robed figure standing on a stone promontory at dusk. Consider who likely carried this device. A wealthy patron, a civic official, a military commander, a powerful merchant, someone for whom the heavens were not merely beautiful, but useful. Same figure silhouetted against a dusk harbor, ships at anchor, warm, dying light on the water. He wanted the authority the machine conferred, the aura of a man who could read the heavens, without necessarily possessing a single line of the mathematics that made it possible. And that mathematics is where the story turns strange again. Because the arithmetic the mechanism uses to predict eclipses is not Greek geometry at all. It is Babylonian arithmetic, a tradition of meticulous observational records and numerical pattern finding, built up over centuries in the temple complexes of Babylon and Uruk. Both cities lay in what is now Iraq, roughly the distance from London to Edinburgh apart from one another. And for generations, their priests had recorded the sky night after night in clay. The Greeks inherited that vast stream of data through the conquests of Alexander and the cultural fusion of the Hellenistic world that followed in his wake. And they fused it with their own geometric and mechanical traditions to produce something that neither civilization could have made alone. A monument in bronze to synthesis itself. One name rises above the others as the likely intellectual ancestor of this device, a man of the 2nd century before Christ, known specifically for blending Babylonian arithmetic with Greek geometric theory. Island of Rhodes, coastline at golden hour, ancient harbor visible. He worked on an island in the eastern Aegean, an island that appears, based on calibration data embedded in the mechanism's own inscriptions, to be the precise location for which its astronomical tables were calculated. His name was Hipparchus, and the island was Rhodes. To understand how this machine came to rest on the ocean floor, we have to reconstruct the voyage that ended in the strait off Antikythera. The vessel is now dated, on the evidence of its ceramics and its coins, to roughly 70 to 60 years before Christ. It was a period of intense Roman military and political activity across the eastern Mediterranean. The cargo that went down with it, luxury statues, fine glassware, bronze fittings, carved marble, matches exactly the kind of cultural loot that Roman commanders stripped from conquered Greek and Asian cities. Those spoils were carried back to Rome to be paraded through the streets in triumphal processions. Julius Caesar in marble, museum lighting, shallow depth of field. And this is where a name rises out of the wreck that almost everyone alive today would recognize. Several researchers, most prominently Xenophon Mousas of the University of Athens, have proposed, and the cargo profile is broadly consistent with the idea, that this ship was carrying its treasures to support the 4 consecutive triumphs Caesar staged in September of 46 BCE, celebrating his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. Caesar was famous and famously criticized for the theatrical scale of his triumphs. captured weapons, exotic animals, and marvels of every kind displayed before roaring crowds. Hand-cranked Roman interior that could predict eclipses and trace the wandering paths of the planets would have been precisely the kind of spectacular intellectual trophy that told a Roman audience the East had been conquered. We can never know with certainty that the mechanism was bound for Caesar's triumph. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and scholars remain divided. But the possibility is not frivolous. Somewhere in the narrow strait between Antikythera and Crete, the vessel foundered. From storm or reef or navigational error, the evidence cannot tell us. It sank in roughly 60 meters of water, and there it would remain, undisturbed, until Elias Stadiatis descended through the blue in the spring of 1900. The wreck site on the seafloor, silt drifting, absolute stillness. And then, nothing. The workshops that produced it left not a single successor in the material record. No comparable mechanism, no fragment of a gear train of matching ambition, no technical treatise explaining how such a device might be built for the next 14 centuries. Dust motes in a single beam of light. Not a gear, not a fragment, not a single text that explains how to build one. Ancient Greek workshop, tools and half-finished bronze wheels on a bench, low lamplight, no figures. Whatever workshop tradition produced the Antikythera Mechanism, and it was almost certainly not one workshop or one generation, but a living tradition of accumulated craft knowledge. That tradition died. It left almost no trace behind. The first European mechanical astronomical clocks, raised in the cathedral cities of England and Italy in the 14th century after Christ, were built, as far as their makers knew, from nothing. They did not know they were reinventing something. And the mechanism was almost certainly not the only device of its kind. Ancient writers like Cicero and Posidonius, and the biographers of Archimedes, refer to mechanical astronomical displays in terms that suggest such instruments were known, if not widely circulated. Close-up. The corroded fragments in the National Archaeological Museum, spotlit against black. But none of those devices survived. This blackened lump is the only physical witness to a tradition otherwise erased from the material record entirely. Coral and sediment on the largest fragment, texture of 2,000 years of sea. There is a Greek word for what we are left with, hypolepon, meaning the remainder, the residue, the thing that stays behind when everything else has been carried away.